In November 2021, at the United Nations Climate Change Conference COP26 held in Glasgow, President Muhammadu Buhari announced Nigeria's commitment to achieving net zero emissions by 2060. Following this, Vice President Professor Yemi Osinbajo launched Nigeria's Energy Transition Plan (ETP) on August 24, 2022, establishing the country's strategy to reach net zero emissions energy by 2060. So joining us now is Muntaqa Umar-Sadiq, the head of the Energy Transition Office at the Office of the Vice Presidency of Nigeria. Great to have you here and welcome on the show. Mr. President announced Nigeria's net zero aspirations during COP26, and he outlined this in an energy transition plan. Can you tell us more about this?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
The Energy Transition Plan really seeks to address our dual crisis of energy poverty on the one hand, as well as some of the impacts of climate change. More recently, we have been confronted with issues around flood, desertification, erosion on the one hand, and of course on the energy access side, Nigeria is, I believe, the single unelectrified bloc in terms of population. We have major issues. Over 175 million Nigerians that lack access to clean cooking solutions. And so this energy transition plan really seeks to provide that framework in the short term to achieve our short-term goals around universal access, because that's clearly an unfinished agenda. There's still a lot to do to achieve those, but also in the long term, net zero by 2060 through low-cost carbon energy systems, prioritizing five sectors. So it's really a short-term plan around addressing energy poverty, but in the longer term, really trying to support the country's trajectory towards net zero. But it's a plan that really reflects a vision of Nigeria to have vibrant industries powered by low-carbon technologies, to have schools and power healthcare centers powered by renewable energy, for example, and to have the dignity of Nigerians and enable them in terms of their productive uses and electric mobility as well. So our streets lined with electric vehicles. So it's a forward-looking plan, but the work to build the right foundations for that to happen needs to happen now.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Achieving the energy transition goals in Nigeria requires significant financial, contribution, resources. And the Energy Transition Office is convening a private sector roundtable in Lagos today, from what we hear. What is the objective of this roundtable engagement, and what is the role of the private sector in supporting Nigeria's energy transition plan?
Sure. I think just to take a step back, our plan to achieve net zero by 2060 costs roughly $410 billion in excess of business as usual spending, right? Given our constrained fiscal space as a country, I think we need to be quite innovative around mobilizing that kind of resources. We have a couple of things I think that we have tried to do to create that enabling environment, because much of that capital will have to come from the private sector. One, we have spent some time curating a pipeline of projects, proven projects that both on and off grid across the value chain. So from gas-fired commercialization projects to interconnected mini-grid projects to LPG expansion projects. And we want an opportunity to develop synergies between the needs of these projects and the capabilities and capital of the private sector. So the private sector roundtable today is really around that. It's really around aligning private sector investment portfolios to these energy transition efforts on the one hand, but also establishing a private sector working group that continues to provide the stewardship required to finance and implement the energy transition plan. And so we're quite excited actually about this convening, because it's the first time to also give the public sector feedback mechanism as to the important bottlenecks to address if we want to mobilize this sort of resources to achieve our goals. And it would include, things around on the policy side, on the regulatory side, but also project-based bottlenecks to remove to sort of achieve our goal. And we're looking at a number of instruments, even beyond private sector investments. More recently, the Vice President has launched an Africa Carbon Market Initiative. The Nigeria Council on Climate Change has also been established. So there's a vehicle also in government to help to shape markets and facilitate investments in the space.
So how can we balance clean energy with just a transition that provides true climate justice for Nigeria?
Well, I think we have to have a nuanced view about what we mean by energy transition in this context, right? I think energy transition means different things to different people. And I think for us, we need space to industrialize, right, within our context. And so for us, gas will continue to be an important transition fuel because we need to harness our own sort of natural resources. So the time in order to do that is important. I think relatively, we contribute relatively little, actually, when it comes to emissions. So I think we need to be context specific in the way that we plan that. And second is that as you look at the cost curve of the technologies like renewable or green hydrogen down the line, there's an opportunity off-grid to support the scale-up, right? Meaning with mini grids, with solar home systems. And so that integration, both on-grid but also off-grid opportunities to be able to accelerate the coverage for electricity, I think is an important conversation. The third piece, I think, for us is around jobs, right? I think in our context, aligning energy transition to our economic priorities, so lifting 100 million people out of poverty, ensuring that in the oil and gas sector, how do we rescale and support the human resource shifts required, whether it's in renewables or other important sectors. This is the time to begin to build that capacity and shift going forward. So I think those are the important implications when we say just and equitable transition in this context. And I think the private sector too is an important part of that, whether it's through technology transfers or capital. And having the international community really recognize the fact that in the context of gas investment from EU, that decades of gas and space required for investments is important. So yes, for us, just means jobs. It means gas as an important transition fuel, and it means a minimum energy threshold of roughly 1,000 kilowatts hour per capita for Nigerians is sort of an important piece of the conversation.
All right, great. So I like that you've spoken about collaborating with the private sector a number of times when we were speaking. And later on today, you have a roundtable with the private sector. Who are the participants who are joining you? Is it a closed meeting or is it open to the public to participate? And then what would you be looking at as an outcome from this roundtable?
Sure. So the private sector constituency relevant here both on the supply and demand side, so providers of capital, but also the developers that we need. Our energy transition plan has 5 important verticals, so 5 sectors that we have prioritized. They represent 65% of our emissions in Nigeria. So from transportation to oil and gas, to clean cooking, to industry. And so we have private sector actors within those spaces, but also the investment community. What we're solving for is that every year will require roughly $10 billion to achieve our goals. And we think that raising that amount of money will require the right signaling from our local private sector. So what would it take, right, to get, for example, our pension funds locally involved? Because only if our local private sector leads that the international community would be able to sort of follow suit. And we recognize there are important fiscal constraints, enabling environment constraints that we need to put as preconditions to achieve that. And this discussion today is an important part of beginning that conversation.
How realistic is the conversation around our local private sector leading the way, when you look at the antecedents of the economy as we speak today?
That's a great question. And I think that we need to temper idealism, our ambitious aspirations, with pragmatism.
Yeah.
But here is why I'm hopeful. 3 reasons. First is that I've spoken a bit about this $10 billion. We're already seeing the private sector lead, right? So ARM Harriet are now $300 million towards ESG and energy transition. Chapel Hill, for example, $200 million. How can we scale that up? So those learnings, how can we make sure those pioneers, that we understand what it takes to make that scalable? That's one. But secondly is that much of the conversation we're having today is around particular projects, right? So you might have heard about the 14 IPP projects or gas flare commercialization projects. These are billions of dollars projects that the private sector itself needs to invest in. So we are looking at specifically for those projects, what would it take to remove the barriers so that we flood in investments to them? We're not talking about macro reforms that will take a long time, that's significant complexities, but project-specific constraints, quick wins. But thirdly, and I'll let you say, thirdly is really about shaping markets, because if we develop our carbon markets, we estimate that by 2050, over $100 billion per year can happen in Africa. That will take some time, but I think in terms of sustainable financing, that is what makes it quite hopeful for the numbers to potentially add up. But we understand the significant challenges, and that's why I want to listen today. to achieve that.
But I just wanted to chip in the case about the regulatory bottlenecks. You know, you kept on talking about the carbon flaring. We know that this has a gas flaring project, a commercialization project. This has been on for a while.
Good, yes.
But we've not been able to hit, you know, terra firma as regards this because, as we both know, the regulatory bottlenecks, even the policy somersaults, all right, the tactical policy somersaults. A clear case is the Ministry, you know, Petroleum Resources talking about at some point the institution of CNG gas to be used in cars and the likes, you know, which we thought it was a cleaner version of fuel and all of that. But where's the policy today? So how do you straddle through those bottlenecks?
So I think the devil is always in the detail when it comes to policy, right? And we are under the impression that, one, having a detailed energy transition plan that just provides the longer-term framework to achieve what we want to do in electric vehicles. So in fact, to speak to EV, we have two options. On the one hand, leverage our natural gas, right? And
CNG?
use CNG, good. And that way, but automobiles are, typically in this context, second-hand, right? Second-hand markets in a sense. And so there is that risk of stranded capacity, if you like, right? In terms of where the world is going. Or on the other hand, we can go directly to electric vehicles, right? So what we have spent a lot of time doing is that mainstreaming or alignment between the NDC on the one hand and the energy transition plan, right? And because the Vice President chairs an energy transition working group that includes all of the actors, right? Meaning from power, transportation, but even the private sector associations, there's some consensus around, okay, what would it take for government to achieve some of this e-mobility? And that has taken a lot more time than I would have thought. We spend most of our time doing a lot of internal government coordination and alignment around policy coherence. Now, second and linked to that is that, you know, there's a political transition now going on, right? So we're trying to spend a lot of time looking at the institutionalization. So distilling much of what is in the energy transition plan towards the policy guidance and directives needed in the Ministry of Environment and Transportation to make some of these things relatively more irreversible and address some of the policy inconsistencies. Because we recognize that, yes, we have seen that happen. And for the gas flare commercialization projects, we've had over 2 or 3 false starts. You're totally right. And these sorts of conversations, so in fact, the sponsors of the gas flare commercialization are attending this meeting to...
Where is this meeting happening?
It's today at 12:30.
12:30.
Yes, Nordic Hotel. So you're all invited.
Yeah, and asked if it was open to anyone or it's just by invitation.
So we have been quite deliberate about the projects that we have invited, right? However, much of this is really around accountability and listening to felt experiences of these projects, including gas flare commercialization project, but it's quite open to the private sector, you know, broadly defined. Yeah. So yes.
All right, just one question for you in terms of, I know you lean quite heavily on the private sector and buying in their interest in just energy transition, but I think a first place of conversation is the government as well. So even though there's an energy transition team, sometimes the body language or perhaps the policies of the government do not speak to the readiness to embrace just energy transition. Earlier today, we talked about the exploration of oil in Nasarawa State. So if you're talking about this, what's the body language of this? I mean, well, you said it's a transition government, we're transiting now, but just mention that the government takes the lead. I mean, the World Bank head and chair is being removed, and one of the reasons is because of his denial of climate change. But this government, how well do you think they've done in terms of promoting it?
So I think a lot of people assume that when we say transition, we mean leapfrogging overnight to solar capacity, to green hydrogen. No, we have been quite open and upfront about the fact that we need space to industrialize through gas as a transition fuel. So what the government is doing, you mentioned Nasarawa, in my state, Bauchi State as well, is very consistent with how we have laid out the decarbonization milestones of the energy transition plan. So just to start there. The second aspect is that we think that the plan will require deploying significant renewable energy, about 5.3 gigawatts every year till 2060. And so doing activities around green manufacturing, assembly, will be an important piece of unlocking that space. So I think those two levers, gas, but also the new technologies towards transition, will be quite important. And in terms of government, I think the most important thing that government has done is really passing the Climate Change Act, right? So more recently, we have seen the National Council on Climate Change. So there is now an institutional anchor to drive a lot of, and it's new, right? So it's still early. Capacity will be obviously required to scale up, but with great leadership and drive to take on both the climate change issues, but in a manner that is consistent with our energy transition.
Well, thank you so much, Muntaqa Umar-Sadiq, head of the Energy Transition Office, for speaking to us this morning.